The ICU at St. Michael's in Atlanta hums with fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell of bleach mixing with fear sweat. Laura Bennett moves between monitors in pale blue scrubs, her gait controlled despite a slight limp favoring her left leg, a gift from Fallujah, though nobody here knows that. She checks vitals on the comatose patient in room 4, Captain Marcus Hayes, Green Beret, 3 years in a minimally conscious state since the insurgent attack that nearly killed him. Under his bed, wrapped in plastic, a pair of worn combat boots caked in dried mud and dark stains that tell a story nobody's supposed to read. Laura's hands, scarred knuckles, rope burn marks on her wrists from extraction lines, calluses that come from 22 years of holding lives together, enter numbers into the tablet with unnatural steadiness. O2 sat 96. Heart rate 58, steady. Blood pressure 118/71. The kind of vitals that come from a young man's body still strong enough to survive things that should have killed him. She didn't know that a Black Hawk would land in the parking lot 47 minutes from now. Dr. Caldwell watches from the nurse's station, his posture calculated, his navy suit tailored in a way that costs more than Laura's monthly rent. He's reviewing a file folder with the resident entourage trailing behind him like remoras around a shark. One resident clutches a tablet. Another scribbles notes. They move with the deference of men who believe hierarchy is the same as competence. Caldwell's eyes narrow as he scans the unit logs, watching the way Laura refuses to initial the billing for the $4,200 ultrasound machine that Dr. Henderson consulted on at 2 a.m. without actually setting foot in the ICU. The chart shows Laura's note, no physician present during imaging. Equipment charge requires documentation of direct service. Simple. Factual. The kind of meticulous charting that makes fraud look like negligence. He had no idea that those scars on her wrists came from pulling Hayes from a burning Humvee under insurgent fire while rounds snapped past her helmet. He had no idea that her nursing credentials were placed in the system by Naval Intelligence 6 months ago specifically to monitor this room. He had no idea that the quiet woman in the corner scrubs wasn't a nurse at all. She was a Master Chief Petty Officer embedded in his hospital to protect a patient from a threat that wasn't random, wasn't finished, and wasn't documented anywhere in the official investigation. Laura moves to the medication station and pulls Hayes' daily meds, phenytoin for seizure prophylaxis, 300 milligrams. Morphine for pain he can't express. A stool softener because dignity means something even when consciousness doesn't. The medication cups make a soft clink as she organizes them on the tray. The ventilator beside his bed wheezed its mechanical rhythm like a metronome counting the hours of a life suspended between living and waiting. That ventilator had been running for 1,095 days. She knew the exact number. She counted it every morning. Caldwell appears at the nurse's station and gestures. The residents scatter. He approaches Laura with a kind of casual stride that only works when you've never had to think about your effect on a room. His cologne arrives first, something expensive that smells like confidence and debt. He's holding her notes from this morning, printed out, highlighted in yellow. Bennett. Not good morning. Not how are you. Just the name, delivered flat. Laura looks up from the medication tray. Her eyes are a shade between gray and green, the kind of color that doesn't photograph well because cameras can't capture the absence of expression. Doctor. I'm seeing 17 protocol violations in your charting from the 6 a.m. assessment. He holds the paper up like evidence at trial. None of it's true. The charting is immaculate. Your scope as a bedside RN doesn't extend to questioning physician orders. She sets down the medication cup. Picks up the next one. I chart what I observe. What you observe. He makes it sound like a diagnosis. You know, the last nurse who had ideas about her role ended up needing a security escort to her car. He turns to the resident. The resident laughs. Too loud. Too desperate. The kind of laugh that happens when junior people are learning which way the wind blows. Nurses who think they're doctors usually end up getting escorted out in handcuffs. That's the thing about ambition at the bedside, it's not dangerous. It's just sad. The room doesn't change. The ventilator still wheezed. The heart monitor still beeped its steady rhythm from room 4. Laura doesn't flinch. She doesn't burn red. She doesn't retreat. Her jaw tightens for approximately half a heartbeat, the kind of micro-expression most people miss, the kind of control that only comes from having survived things worse than a surgeon's contempt. She finishes organizing the medication cups. Sets them in the designated order. Glances at her watch, 6:13 a.m. She had 2 hours and 13 minutes until Hayes was due for his position change, 4 hours and 17 minutes until the respiratory team rounded, and apparently no idea that a 2-star general was currently driving through Atlanta's morning traffic with her extraction orders and a file that would make Caldwell's entire surgical career look like a charity case. Anything else, doctor? Her voice is the sound of someone who has learned that quiet doesn't mean weak. It means efficient. Caldwell smiles. He shouldn't have. Just keep to your lane, Bennett. He walks away with his resident following like a satellite. Laura returns to the medication tray. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the conscious decision not to reach for the trauma shears hanging from her scrub pocket and make him understand, in terms his body would comprehend immediately, exactly who he was speaking to. But that wasn't the mission. The mission was Hayes. The mission was staying invisible long enough to find out who'd tried to finish what the insurgents started. She enters room 4 with the morning medications and her tactical breathing pattern, 4 counts in, 6 counts out, the meditation of someone trained to survive. Hayes lies in the hospital bed looking like a statue carved from exhaustion. The feeding tube runs into his nose. The Foley catheter runs into him. The ventilator runs beside him, a rhythm that has become the sound of his existence. His left arm is amputated at the elbow. His right leg is anchored with metal pins that serve as external fixation for the shattered femur. 3 years of healing that looks like suspension. She checks his pupils. Reactive. She checks the ventilator settings. Appropriate. She enters the vitals into the computer with her hand steady as surgical lasers, her eyes lingering on the chart where his next of kin is listed as none. No family. No visitors in 1,095 days. No one to ask about the letter he'd written to her son before the attack, the one that explained why her boy wasn't coming home, the one that made her drive to Fort Liberty and ask Naval Intelligence to put her back in the field. "You're going to get out of here," she says, so quietly the ventilator almost swallows it. "I'm going to make sure of that." Hayes's pupils track slightly. Some part of him heard. Some part of him remembered. Laura checks the exposed boots under the bed, her boots, the ones she'd given him in Fallujah when his were blown off, still stained with his blood because washing them would mean forgetting, and she couldn't afford to forget. Not until she found who'd ordered the follow-up attack. She exits the room at 6:54 a.m. She has no idea what happens next. No idea that in 43 minutes, the security cameras in the parking lot will capture a Black Hawk landing in the emergency zone. No idea that a 2-star general is currently reading her jacket to 3 Navy SEALs who are about to walk through the front entrance. No idea that Dr. Caldwell's entire career is about to collapse like a tower built on fraud and the arrogance of a man who made the mistake of threatening someone he'd never bothered to actually see. But in this moment, at 6:54 a.m. in St. Michael's ICU, Laura Bennett stands at the medication station and counts the hours until she could finish what she started 3 years ago. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head. The monitors beeped their collective rhythms. The morning shift arrived in layers, nurses with coffee, residents with ambition, orderlies with knowledge of 1,000 small secrets nobody asked about. And somewhere in that machinery of medicine and bureaucracy, a Marine who should have died was being protected by someone he'd never see coming. The ward smelled like antiseptic and unfinished business. It was about to get a whole lot louder. The ward smelled like antiseptic and unfinished business. It was about to get a whole lot louder. Grand rounds at St. Michael's happened every Tuesday at 9 a.m. sharp, and this particular morning, Dr. Caldwell had arrived with a leather portfolio and something worse than ambition, certainty. 14 residents crowded room 4, their white coats starched and pristine, their notebooks ready. for attending physicians clustered near the door like spectators at an execution. Laura stood against the far wall, her scrubs the color of the walls themselves, nearly invisible. She'd learned long ago that invisible was safer. Dr. Caldwell pulled a patient chart from his portfolio, Captain Marcus Hayes's file, and held it up like evidence at trial. His fingers were manicured. His cufflinks caught the fluorescent light. "Class," he said, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered, "I want you to identify the 17 protocol violations in these notes. This is what happens when a nurse decides her 2-year degree makes her qualified to practice medicine." He let that hang for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds too long. One of the residents, a woman with dark hair pulled back tight, leaned forward. Caldwell circled a notation in red marker, his movements theatrical, purposeful. "See this assessment? Unauthorized." The nurse documented neurological status without physician orders. "And this notation here?" He tapped the chart with his marker. "Practicing beyond scope." Again. 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 Each word punctuated with the marker against paper, a sound like small deliberate strikes. Laura's jaw tightened. Not visibly to anyone watching directly, but the resident nearest her, a young man from Johns Hopkins, noticed the muscles at her jaw clench for exactly 2 seconds. Then they released. Her hands remained clasped behind her back. "Steady. Still." "Nurse Bennett," Caldwell said, finally acknowledging her presence with the tone someone might use to acknowledge a piece of furniture that had spoken out of turn, "perhaps you could explain why your charting suggests you possess diagnostic authority." "I documented what I observed," she said quietly. Her voice carried no inflection. No defensiveness. Just fact. Pupil response. Reflexes. Exact measurements. Which you are not qualified to interpret. I'm qualified to observe and report. Which I did. One of the residents actually wrote that down. Caldwell saw it happen and his smile became something with edges. "Are you questioning my teaching, or should I question your evaluation?" he asked the resident, his voice dropping 40 degrees. The resident went silent. Wrote nothing else. Caldwell continued through the chart, holding it up for the group, highlighting notations that were textbook accurate, that were careful, that were the work of someone who understood that lives hung on precision. He made them sound like crimes. The residents began nodding along. Muscle memory and hierarchy working in unison. If the attending said something was wrong, something was wrong. That was how the system worked. That was how it had always worked. Laura took notes on her tablet. The residents glanced at her occasionally, trying to gauge if they should be ashamed of her or afraid. Neither, Laura had learned, was accurate. But people needed categories. People needed boxes. By the time Caldwell finished, he'd invented 17 violations, articulated them with confidence, and ensured that every resident in that room now believed Laura Bennett was dangerous. Not incompetent, worse. Competent enough to be dangerous. Competent enough to believe she understood things she didn't. That was the narrative. That was the shape he'd given it. As the residents filed out, they avoided her eyes. At 3 p.m., the third-floor vending machine near the staff lounge hummed its mechanical song. Laura inserted bills and selected black coffee, no sugar. The machine dispensed a cup with the sound of a mechanism finding its groove, plastic cup hitting the retrieval slot with a hollow click. Behind her, Dr. Caldwell arrived with an intern, a young man barely 25, still soft with the idea that the world was meritocratic, that good work got recognized. "You know what we call nurses like Florence Nightingale over there." Caldwell's voice carried the way voices do when a man assumes no one in the target of his speech will respond. Laura's hand hovered over the coffee button for half a second. She pressed it anyway. The machine hummed. Wannabes. She probably watches Grey's Anatomy and thinks she's a surgeon. The intern laughed nervously. Laura lifted her cup. The coffee was still hot enough to generate steam that carried the smell of something that had been burned to extract flavor. Caldwell wasn't finished. His voice had that particular quality of a man who'd calculated the distance and knew she could hear him. "I hear she's been asking questions about billing codes for room 4. Someone should tell her that nurses who stick their noses in administration business usually need security escorts to their cars. For their own safety, of course." He let that sit. Let it breathe. Let it become a suggestion of threat, carefully worded so plausible deniability was built into the sentence structure. Laura's finger hovered over the coffee cup's lid. 1 extra second. 2. Then she pulled it free, took a sip, and walked past both of them without a word, her face showing polite attention to nothing, the expression of someone hearing elevator music, neither present nor absent. The intern watched her go. Is she actually doing something wrong? She's doing everything wrong, Caldwell said, his eyes tracking her down the corridor. She just does it quietly. That evening, from his office on the 4th floor, Dr. Caldwell opened his email and began to type. His fingers moved with the precision of someone who'd written letters like this before, probably to ensure that someone like him stayed positioned above someone like her. The email read, "I must bring to your attention some concerning behavior patterns regarding one of our nursing staff. Laura Bennett has been documenting medical assessments beyond her scope of practice, asking questions about billing procedures, and demonstrating a pattern of unauthorized autonomy that could expose St. Michael's to liability. I recommend we initiate a credentialing review and audit her employment file immediately. As you know, protocols exist for a reason, and I believe we have a duty to enforce them before something more serious occurs. Best regards, Dr. Caldwell." He hit send at 6:11 p.m. In a copy went the chief nursing officer, the hospital board chairman, who owed Caldwell favors from a gambling debt covered quietly 2 years prior, and the director of human resources, whose career depended on liability management. By 7 p.m., the message had been read 3 times. By 8 p.m., a file request had been typed. By 9 p.m., Laura's employment file began its journey into scrutiny, and the machinery of institutional power started to turn. She didn't know it yet. She was in her apartment in Buckhead, the one rented under a cover identity that would hold up to cursory inspection but would shatter if anyone actually looked. She sat at her kitchen table with a secure phone, encrypted, untraceable, a device that would combust if anyone tried to hack it, and stared at it like it might ring of its own volition. The phone was a link to command. To mission parameters. To the reason she'd spent 3 years in this hospital, watching a man she'd pulled out of a burning Humvee while rounds were coming in all around her, watching him breathe artificially, watching him hover in a space between life and something else. Captain Marcus Hayes had been her commanding officer once. Not directly, Master Chief Petty Officers didn't report to Green Berets, but in the hierarchy of that particular operation in Fallujah, he'd been the man who decided whether she went in or stayed back. He decided she went in. 8 minutes later, the Humvee caught fire. 12 seconds after that, she had him over her shoulder and was moving toward extraction while the insurgent position corrected its aim and the sun beat down like judgment from above. 3 years ago. 3 years of not knowing if he'd wake up. 3 years of watching him in room 4, tubes keeping him alive, his body healed as much as it would ever heal, his mind somewhere else entirely. And now someone was trying to kill him again. Just differently. Just quieter. At 8 a.m. the next morning, Laura arrived to find her badge access restricted. The magnetic strip that had opened every door now opened only room 4, the supply closet, and the staff bathroom on her floor. She stood at the nurse's station and the restriction registered in her mind like reading a tactical map. Someone had drawn a perimeter, and she was being kept inside it. Maria, the charge nurse, pulled her into the break room. Maria had kind eyes and a daughter in college and 5 years until retirement, which meant Maria was very careful about being helpful without being complicit. "Administration's auditing your file," Maria said quietly. The break room smelled like old coffee and someone's microwaved fish from the day before. Caldwell escalated something about credentialing irregularities. "They want your transcripts from nursing school, verification of your clinical hours, the whole background check all over again." Laura's expression didn't change. Couldn't change. But her hand moved unconsciously to her pocket where a phone sat silent. Not the secure one. A regular civilian phone. Any call from it would be traceable. Any communication would become part of her record. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "They said by end of week. But it's moving fast." Caldwell's got the board chairman's ear apparently. Maria's voice dropped further. "There's someone in a dark suit asking about you downstairs. I think it's a private investigator." "Laura, what's happening?" "Protocol issue," Laura said. "I'll handle it." What she didn't say, naval intelligence creates perfect cover identities, but only if they're never examined too closely. Her nursing degree was real. Her nursing school transcripts existed. Her clinical hours had been logged by people who'd been paid to create the documentation. But there were timeline gaps, months she'd been classified elsewhere, that would show up under real scrutiny. And if someone looked at those gaps, if someone started asking questions about where she'd actually been during those months, the entire cover would collapse like a building with its support pillars removed. In room 4, she checked Captain Hayes's vitals and found the change immediately. His supply orders had been altered. The specialized nutritional formula designed specifically for his documented hypersensitivity, a formula that had been keeping his cerebral edema at manageable levels, the difference between a coma he might wake from and a coma he wouldn't, had been switched to a generic substitute. Cost-saving measure. Perfectly legal for someone with Caldwell's authority to authorize. The order was signed, Dr. Caldwell. Timestamp, 6:12 a.m. She opened the drawer where she kept the combat boots, the one she'd given Hayes in Fallujah when his had been blown off, the one still stained with his blood, and found them gone. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. But something in her center went very still, the way a predator goes still when it's identified a threat. At the nurse's station, she calmly requested the formula be reversed, citing Hayes's documented allergies. He's documented as hypersensitive to corn-derived components. The generic contains corn syrup solids. Caldwell appeared within 5 minutes. Response time meant he'd been waiting for her to challenge the order. Meant he'd been testing something. Meant this was calculated. "That formula costs $400 a day," he said, his voice pitched for the residents passing by. "The generic is sufficient. Unless you have a medical degree I don't know about, Nurse Bennett." His smile was the smile of a man winning at something he'd set the rules for. Behind him, at the end of the corridor, a woman in a dark suit watched from the hallway. She took a photograph of Laura's badge using a phone that looked expensive. Took another photograph of her license plate visible through the window. A private investigator, building a dossier. Building a case. Building something that would bury her before the real threat ever reached Hayes. That night, Laura sat in her car in the parking garage of St. Michael's, engine off, and made one encrypted call on the secure phone. The line connected in 2.3 seconds. Military precision. "Cover may be compromised," she said quietly. "Patient's care is being deliberately altered. Request guidance." The response came back in 90 seconds, and with it, everything changed. "Maintain position. Extraction only on your call. Mission priority remains patient security." Laura ended the call. The parking garage was quiet. Empty. The security camera in the corner turned slowly, recording everything, seeing nothing. She sat in the dark and understood that she was running out of time, that the investigation moving toward her would reach her before she could stop it, that the man who wanted her gone was now controlling the medical care of the only witness who could prove what he was. And that was the moment she understood she wasn't just embedded to protect him anymore. She was trapped. The fluorescent badge reader beeped red. Access denied. Laura stood at the employee entrance to St. Michael's at 6:41 a.m., her laminated ID card held at the sensor's eye level for the third time. The same angry pulse of light. The same electronic rejection. Her jaw tightened for half a heartbeat, not from fear, but from the precise calculation of what this meant. Restricted access. Controlled perimeter. They were already boxing her in. She took the stairs to the 4th floor instead of the elevator. Her scrubs were freshly pressed, her hair pulled back in the same tight bun she'd worn for 3 years. Nothing in her posture suggested anything was wrong. Nothing suggested she understood that the walls of St. Michael's were closing around her like a closing fist. But her mind was already 3 moves ahead, the way it had been trained to be in scenarios far worse than administrative bureaucracy. The ICU was quiet at this hour. Ventilators hummed their mechanical lullabies. Monitors beeped their steady reassurance. And in room 4, Captain Marcus Hayes lay exactly where he'd been for the past 72 hours since the crash, his body still wrapped in the machinery that kept him breathing, his feet bare now, the combat boots removed. Laura knew where they were. They were the first thing they'd taken when they decided to audit her. Maria Santos, the charge nurse, was waiting at the station with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone carrying very bad news. She'd been a nurse for 17 years and had the exhausted kindness of someone who'd learned to deliver devastating news with gentleness. Laura took the coffee without asking questions. Maria set hers down and spoke quietly. "Administration flagged your file at midnight," Maria said. "They want a full credentialing audit. Every certification, every degree, every reference. They are questioning your nursing license itself." Maria's voice had the texture of old leather, worn but still holding shape. "Caldwell filed a formal complaint about scope of practice violations. He's saying you performed procedures yesterday that required physician supervision. He's documented it, Laura. Names, times, witnesses." Laura sipped the coffee. It was from the break room machine, lukewarm and tasting like burnt copper. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask how Caldwell could have documented anything because she already knew. Witnesses. The on-call resident. The respiratory therapist. The nursing assistant who'd been standing near the door. All of them would have seen her calling orders. All of them would have heard her voice shift into something that didn't sound like just a nurse. "When?" Laura asked. 2 words. That was all the emotion she allowed herself. "Security's coming at 0800 to search your locker. They're looking for anything that doesn't match your personnel file. Medication samples. Unauthorized equipment. Anything that suggests credentials you didn't disclose." Maria's hands were trembling slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. She knew something was off about Laura. Everyone had always known. But knowing and saying were 2 different things. Your badge access is restricted to this floor and room for only. You're not to interact with other patients or staff until the audit is complete. Laura nodded once. She understood isolation when she saw it. She'd trained for it. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly Caldwell would move from social theater to institutional weaponization. He'd gone from mockery to sabotage in less than 24 hours. That kind of decisiveness meant he had institutional allies. That kind of speed meant he'd already been making calls before dawn. She spent the next hour checking on Captain Hayes. His vital signs were stable. His oxygen saturation was holding at 96%. His pupils were reactive, though he remained in the same impenetrable coma that had held him for 3 years. She changed his 4 lines, adjusted his positioning, and made notes on his chart with the precision she always used, careful, meticulous documentation that proved she knew exactly what she was doing. Every entry was correct. Every medication was documented. Every procedure was within scope. But scope was a legal definition, and legal definitions could be stretched like putty in the hands of someone with enough institutional power. At 7:52 a.m., hospital security arrived with Dr. Caldwell walking between them like a prosecutor entering a courtroom. His hair was wet from a shower. His cologne smelled like expensive things, the kind of fragrance that cost $200 a bottle and announced that he was someone who never had to count money. Laura's locker was in the break room on the 3rd floor. She would not be searching it. Instead, she stood at the nurse's station while Caldwell spoke to the security chief with his voice pitched low but clearly audible. "She's been practicing medicine without a license," Caldwell said. His words were spoken with the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed them in front of a mirror. Yesterday she administered 4 medications at dosages that don't appear in any standard nursing protocol. She barked orders at the resident as if she had attending privileges. I have 3 witnesses who will testify that her behavior was outside her scope of practice and potentially dangerous. The security chief, a man named Torres who'd been an MP before civilian life, looked uncomfortable. We'll inventory her locker and notify her of our findings. Laura watched them descend the stairs. She didn't move. She didn't reach for her phone or her keys or anything that suggested panic. Her hands remained steady. Her breathing remained even. The only thing that changed was her eyes. They went the color of a stormy Atlantic, flat and deep and containing depths that no one in that building was equipped to measure. What happened next was the thing that terrified her most. What happened next was waiting. By 10:06 a.m., her access badge was confiscated. By noon, she was informed that she was being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. By 1 p.m., a human resources representative named Sandra briefed her in a small conference room that smelled like anxiety and fluorescent overhead lighting. The language was corporate and sterile, credentialing irregularities. Scope of practice violations. Unauthorized delegation of medical authority. Potential fraud. Your credentials appear to be in order, Sandra said, reviewing a file that held 3 years of Laura's carefully constructed cover. But there's a discrepancy in how you were credentialed versus how you've been practicing. We need to review your background check, your references, your educational timeline. The background check would hold. It had been built by naval intelligence with the kind of detail that would withstand casual scrutiny. References would check out. Educational credentials would verify. But the investigation itself didn't need to be won. It only needed to be launched. That's how extraction orders worked. That's how cover got blown. Not by someone finding the truth, but by someone asking the right questions loudly enough that headquarters decided it was safer to pull the operative out than to let the investigation continue. Laura signed the paperwork. She turned in her ID badge. She listened to Sandra explain that she'd still receive her paycheck, but she was not to enter the hospital without written authorization until the investigation was complete. She heard it all with the composed detachment of someone who'd heard worse news in worse circumstances. What she couldn't shake was the knowledge that somewhere in this building, Captain Marcus Hayes was lying in room 4 with his monitors running and his fours flowing and no one watching the small patterns that only she had learned to recognize. No one checking the subtle changes in his breathing that suggested his lungs were beginning to fail. No one understanding that the seizure medication Caldwell had ordered switched out, the cheaper, slower-acting alternative, wasn't going to be enough the next time his brain misfired. And she was locked out. The parking lot was empty at 2 p.m. Laura's car sat in the employee section, the asphalt still radiating heat from the morning sun. She sat in the driver's seat for exactly 4 minutes before starting the engine. Then she drove east toward Ponce de Leon, away from St. Michael's, away from Hayes, away from everything that mattered. She drove because she had nowhere else to go. She drove because staying would trigger her extraction. She drove because some missions required you to break them, and the hardest part wasn't admitting defeat. The hardest part was admitting that there was nothing you could do to change it. The Waffle House was the kind of place that existed in every city, anonymous and fluorescent and open at every hour. Laura ordered coffee that the server assured her was fresh but tasted like it had been sitting in the pot since 1987. She sat in a corner booth where she could see the parking lot and both exits. Her hands rested on the table, palms down, steady as surgical steel. Her face showed nothing. Her reflection in the window was hollow-eyed and still, a woman staring back at herself from 3 years ago and wondering if the mission had ever been worth the cost. The coffee went cold. She didn't drink it. What she did was count the ways that everything had collapsed. Caldwell's investigation would trigger a flag in naval intelligence systems. The flag would trigger a status review. The status review would trigger extraction protocols. She'd be pulled. Hayes would be left unprotected. And the reason she'd been inserted in the first place, the reason Naval Intelligence had embedded a Master Chief Petty Officer as a civilian nurse in a civilian hospital was that intercepted communications had suggested the attack that nearly killed Hayes wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone had tried to finish him 3 years ago, and they would try again. And now she'd be gone. At 3:17 a.m., rain began hammering the Waffle House parking lot like applause for something that had already died. Laura sat in her booth and stared at her reflection in the window and understood with the clarity of someone who'd been trained to understand difficult things that saving Captain Marcus Hayes's life might have just signed his death warrant. The monitors in room 4 began screaming at 1:47 in the morning. Laura heard it from the break room, that particular frequency of alarm that meant seizure activity, the kind that made every nerve in the ICU snap to attention like a dog on a taut leash. She was moving before her conscious mind caught up, her legs carrying her through the corridors with the fluid precision of someone whose body had been trained longer than her mind had been allowed to think. The fluorescent lights above her blurred into white streaks as she ran. Hayes's body was rigid, convulsing against the hospital bed restraints, his back arched like a bow drawn too tight. The monitor showed the chaotic spikes of electrical fire in his brain, seizure activity climbing in amplitude and frequency. Laura was through the door calling the code before the day nurse had finished pressing the panic button, her voice cutting through the chaos with the calm of someone who'd given orders in worse places than this, sees activity progressing to status epilepticus. We need anesthesia. We need the crash cart. Now. The on-call resident, a young man named Torres whose hands had started shaking somewhere between the first seizure and the second, arrived at the monitor console with his fingers trembling visibly over the defibrillator controls. Laura could see it immediately, the kind of paralysis that came from knowing too much theory and not enough practice. Get his airway, she told him, her voice level as she checked Hayes's pupils, blown wide, unresponsive. Prepare for intubation. But Torres didn't move. He stood there staring at the defibrillator pads like they might bite him, his Adam's apple working up and down, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The seizure went on. 30 seconds. 40. Hayes's lips were turning blue around the edges, his oxygen saturation dropping with each convulsion. That was when Laura saw it, the subtle shift in the monitor that meant something had broken inside him, something catastrophic. The seizure didn't stop. It evolved. His heart went into something that wasn't quite a rhythm anymore, that stuttering chaos that meant cardiac arrest was coming if she didn't move. His pressures dropping, the nurse beside her said, voice rising in pitch. We're losing him. Hayes's body went limp. The seizure activity stopped because his heart had stopped. The monitor sang out a long, flat tone, asystole, the sound of electrical silence, the sound of death beginning. Torres reached for the defibrillator pads with hands that looked like they belonged to someone else, someone weaker, someone who'd never held a life in their hands and felt it slip away like water through open fingers. His voice cracked, we need cardiothoracic. We need a surgeon. There's no time, Laura said. Those 4 words hung in the room like a held breath. The nurse beside her understood immediately, understood what those words meant, what they asked, what they demanded. The crash cart, Laura said. Second drawer. Scalpel. Give me the spreader. Torres stumbled backward as if he'd been shoved. You can't, Dr. Bennett, you don't have credentials for. Laura was already opening the crash cart. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd performed this exact procedure on a sand-covered Humvee floor with a dust storm howling overhead and an AK-47 round leaving a hole in her flak jacket. The scalpel came out smooth and clean, and muscle memory took over completely. She made the first incision down the center line of Hayes's sternum with the precision of a surgeon who'd trained in field conditions where hesitation meant death, one clean line from the sternal notch down to the xiphoid process. Blood welled along the cut. She didn't hesitate. The second and third incisions followed in rapid sequence, accessing the chest cavity with the kind of speed that only came from having done this when every second meant the difference between a patient who lived and a patient who was dead in the ground. The spreader came from the nurse's hands into hers without a word being spoken between them. Laura positioned it between the ribs and twisted. The bone cracked, a sound like green wood breaking, a sound that made Torres take another step backward, his hand pressed against his mouth. The chest cavity opened, and there it was, Hayes's heart, pale and motionless, surrounded by blood and fluid that shouldn't have been there. His chest was filling with something internal, something catastrophic. Defibrillation wouldn't fix this. Nothing would fix this except hands and pressure and rhythm. Laura's hands went into the cavity. The blood was warm, slick. Pain was information, and her hands read that information like a field medic reading vital signs, told her where the rupture was, what had failed, what she could salvage. Her left hand cupped his heart. Her right hand came underneath. She began compression, squeezing the fist-sized muscle with the perfect rhythm that meant blood moving, oxygen flowing, a spark that might ignite into heartbeat again. Once. Twice. She counted under her breath like a metronome, like a soldier keeping time under fire. Her elbows locked. Her shoulders drove the compression deeper. The blood that soaked into her scrubs didn't matter. Nothing mattered except rhythm, pressure, and the tiny tremor she felt under her hands that might be the beginning of electrical activity or might be muscle memory firing one last time. "He's in V-fib," the nurse said quietly, and Laura heard in those 4 words the understanding that Torres still didn't have, that her hands were doing the work that medication and equipment could only assist with, that she was becoming the heart until the heart remembered how to beat. 1 milligram epi, Laura said. The 4 went in. The medication pushed through. She kept compressing, kept counting, kept pushing oxygen into dead tissue and praying that somewhere in the electrical silence, something was listening. "Come on, Hayes. Come on, Captain. You survived worse than this." The monitor stayed flat. 60 seconds. 70. Her arms burned with an intensity that was almost clean compared to the other pain she carried, the pain of knowing she'd been sitting in a Waffle House 3 hours ago watching her own reflection disappear while the man under her hands was dying alone in this bed. Then it came, a flutter. A hesitation. The flat line jerked up. The monitor showed 1 beat. 2 beats. 3 beats. The rhythm became something that approximated normal, something that looked like sinus rhythm trying to remember what it was supposed to do. Hayes's heart beat under her hands, not from her hand anymore but because of them, because she'd reminded it how. Laura withdrew her hand slowly, counted out the next 30 seconds of compressions at a slower pace, then stepped back and turned to the sink. The water ran warm over her forearms, washing away blood that had soaked past her wrists and up past her elbows, and she kept her breathing steady and her face neutral because that was how you survived these moments, not by feeling them, but by doing the next thing that needed doing. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 2:04 in the morning, 20 minutes after Hayes's heart had remembered its rhythm. He stood in the doorway of room for 3 full seconds, taking in the scene, Hayes stable, 3 nurses with all written across their faces like a brand, and Laura Bennett standing at the sink with blood running down her forearms, her scrub soaked red to the elbows, her expression as calm as if she'd just finished washing her hands before lunch. The calculation happened behind Caldwell's eyes immediately, the chess player recognizing a piece had moved to an unexpected square. What exactly happened here? His voice was ice in a glass. The resident, still pale, still shaking, stumbled over his words. She performed emergency thoracotomy. She opened his chest cavity manually. His pressure was dropping, his heart went into arrest, and she, Torres gestured helplessly at Hayes, at the open wound that had been expertly closed with the kind of sutures that spoke of professional precision, at the monitor showing regular sinus rhythm where there had been flat line. She saved his life. Caldwell's expression didn't change. She performed surgery. Without credentials. Without authorization. Without supervision. He stepped backward into the hallway, and his voice carried down the corridor with the precision of a man who'd learned to make important decisions with an audience. "Get me administration. Get me the board chairman. I want to know how this hospital licenses nurses to practice cardiothoracic procedures." He pulled a phone from his pocket. The first call went through immediately, his voice smooth as silk. "Hello, Chief. We have a situation at St. Michael's. A nurse just opened a patient's chest cavity without authorization." "Yes. I'll wait while you call the Inspector General." By 2:44 a.m., Dr. Caldwell's hands trembled as he gripped his office phone, not from fear, but from a surgeon's rage at losing control. The first call went to hospital board chairman Gerald Hutchins, a man who owed him 3 favors from the cardiology wing renovations Caldwell had approved. "She performed surgery she's not qualified for," Caldwell said, his voice steady as surgical steel. "I need her credentials audited by morning. Everything." The second call reached administration. "Employment records. Scope violations. I want them documented before day shift." The third call went to a private investigator he kept on retainer, a former detective who understood how to bury problems quietly. "Find credentialing gaps. Gaps big enough to charge her?" Caldwell hung up and sat in the darkness of his office, listening to the hospital's night sounds, the distant beep of monitors, the whisper of ventilators keeping bodies alive, the soft footsteps of nurses moving through corridors like ghosts. He'd salvaged this before. A complaint here, a reassignment there, a whispered word to the right person. This would be no different. It was different. By 8:15 a.m., Laura received a call from Human Resources directing her to administration immediately. The administrator's office felt like a steel cage, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, 2 HR representatives sitting across from her with prepared statements and legal language. "Credentialing irregularities," they said. "Scope of practice violations." The words were careful, clinical, the kind of language that protected institutions while destroying individuals. "You're on administrative leave pending investigation. Your ID badge is confiscated. Your locker will be searched." Laura's face remained composed as they slid the suspension notice across the table. She didn't blink. Didn't ask questions. She simply nodded, removed her badge, the weight of it lifting from her scrubs, the absence of it suddenly heavier than its presence had ever been, and stood to leave. The administrator added quietly, "Don't come back to the hospital until we contact you. This isn't personal, Ms. Bennett. It's protocol. Protocol." The word hung in the air like cordite after gunfire. Laura walked out of that office the way she'd walked out of countless debriefs after classified operations, composure intact, mind already calculating next moves. But for the first time in 3 years, she had no moves left. She'd blown her cover to save a man's life. Now there was nothing between Marcus Hayes and whoever had tried to kill him in the first place. The sound came first, a distant percussion that made every window in the hospital rattle. By 11:58 a.m., the UH-60 Black Hawk descended toward St. Michael's parking lot like an apex predator dropping from the sky. The rotor wash hit the administrative parking lot with the force of a hurricane, sending papers flying across asphalt, scattering clipboards and patient files into the air like autumn leaves. Hospital staff emerged from side doors, shielding their eyes, watching in confusion as the aircraft settled onto the ground with a pneumatic sigh. Nobody landed a military helicopter at a civilian hospital unless something catastrophic had happened or something extraordinary was about to. 2 Marines walked through the front entrance at 12:03 p.m., dress blues immaculate, boots striking tile in perfect synchronization. The lead Marine approached the security desk. "We're looking for Chief Bennett." Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from muscle memory, from years of following orders that meant life and death. The security guard's face went pale. I don't think we have a Chief Bennett." The Marine's eyes didn't move. "Then we'll find her ourselves." In the lobby, Dr. Caldwell was mid-sentence during a press conference about hospital safety protocols, his words flowing smoothly into the ears of 3 local news reporters. He was explaining how St. Michael's maintained rigorous standards, how every procedure was documented, how nothing fell through the cracks under his watch. His voice carried the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned, never been challenged, never imagined that the carefully constructed architecture of his authority could collapse in seconds. The general walked through the automatic doors at 12:07 p.m. 2 stars on his shoulder board, dress blues pressed with enough precision to cut glass, face carved from someone who'd made decisions that sent other people's children into battle. He was reading from a file as he moved across the lobby floor, his voice carrying without needing to project. Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. Naval Special Warfare Command. 3 tours. Silver Star. Credited with 17 combat saves including the extraction of a downed helicopter crew under fire under circumstances that would have resulted in a court-martial for any officer who'd done the same thing. He looked up from the file. We sent her here. The lobby went silent. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they've been standing in a room with someone whose presence they completely misread. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old bone. The reporter's camera swung away from him and toward the general. The board chairman took a step back, then another, his mouth slightly open. Captain Marcus Hayes appeared in a wheelchair pushed by his ICU nurse, and in his lap, cradled like an artifact from a museum, were worn combat boots stained dark with 3-year-old blood. The leather was cracked, the laces frayed, the heels worn through at the seams, the boots of someone who'd walked through fire. Hayes's voice emerged slowly, each word deliberate as a man rebuilding language after nearly losing his life. She pulled me from a burning Humvee. Fallujah. 3rd tour, Jolin District. Insurgent fire from 2 positions. He looked directly at Caldwell, then at the reporters, then at the board chairman. Taking incoming. She didn't hesitate. Got me out. Got the driver out. Disappeared before medevac arrived. His hands gripped the boots tighter. I've been searching for 3 years. Pictures, descriptions, nothing. But I knew her hands. Knew her voice. Knew the boots she gave me when mine were blown off her feet. His voice cracked slightly. I knew her. The general turned toward Dr. Caldwell with the smooth precision of a man executing a predetermined maneuver. Dr. Marcus Caldwell. You're terminated, effective immediately. Your investigation by the federal government will proceed without hospital interference, given your documented billing practices regarding 47 Medicare claims, 12 equipment purchases that don't appear in hospital systems, and a supply contract that's been paying you $60,000 annually for a position that doesn't exist. The general paused. Since this is now a federal matter, you'll be answering to the Inspector General about fraud, kickbacks, and the deliberate alteration of a protected military witness's medical care. Caldwell's hands began to shake. Not from the shock of exposure, but from the realization that every alliance he'd cultivated, every favor he'd called in, every connection he'd built was about to evaporate. His voice rose, cracking slightly. This is ridiculous. I saved this hospital millions, but nobody was listening anymore. The board chairman was already on his phone. The hospital director had disappeared from the administration wing. The reporters were filming everything, capturing every angle of his face, every moment of his disintegration. 6 months later, a local news camera caught Dr. Caldwell in a community college parking lot, carrying a CPR dummy toward a classroom, the on-screen caption reading, former St. Michael's department head now teaching CPR certification classes, $13 an hour. Federal charges had accumulated like debt, 18 counts of Medicare fraud, conspiracy, kickbacks. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. The affluent neighborhood he'd lived in, the vacation home in Kiowa Island, the luxury practice he'd built, all of it bleeding away to legal fees and federal penalties. Inside St. Michael's, the ICU had been formally renamed the Captain Marcus Hayes Recovery Wing. Laura stood in full dress blues at the dedication ceremony, her Navy Cross visible on her chest, ribbons arranged with the precision of someone who'd worn a uniform through 3 combat tours. Captain Hayes stood beside her without a wheelchair, walking with a cane, his movement slow but present, his speech rebuilding itself one word at a time. He held the combat boots in one hand, the same boots from Fallujah, now preserved in a glass case that would hang on the wall. The hospital director presented Laura with a framed commendation and a formal job offer, Director of Clinical Excellence and Veteran Services. The position came with authority, with resources, with the ability to shape how the hospital treated the people who came through its doors carrying invisible wounds. Laura accepted with a handshake, composure still intact, then knelt beside Hayes as he gripped her hand with both of his, tears streaming down his face. She was crying too now, the 3 years of separation, the 3 years of watching him from a distance while invisible enemies tried to finish what Fallujah had started, the 3 years of maintaining the mask, all of it finally released. Hayes whispered, "You saved me twice." His voice was barely audible but solid. Once in Fallujah when everyone was watching. Once here when nobody knew your name. Laura's voice remained steady, the voice of someone who'd given orders in combat zones, who'd made decisions that meant life and death, who'd carried weight that no civilian uniform could express. "You led my son into battle and brought him home. That's a debt I'll never repay." A 2-star general approached with a shadow box containing her full decorations, the medals arranged in ascending order of prestige, the citations, the photograph from her last deployment. "Your son would be proud, Master Chief." Later, alone in room 4, Laura placed the combat boots in a mounted glass case with a plaque reading, "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." She stood at attention and saluted the empty room once, the gesture sharp and deliberate, then turned back toward the corridor where sick people needed healing, where hidden strength waited to be discovered, where quiet warriors had always done the most important work. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, like, and let us know in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Because the people who matter always seem to find out eventually.